Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I'm Congressman Joe Crowley. I'm chair of the Democratic Caucus, and I'm joined this morning by a number of my colleagues, Nydia Velázquez from New York, Congressman Jose Serrano from New York, as well as Yvette Clarke from New York. Just about all of New York is represented here in one way or another. But they're here today to talk about the devastation that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have experienced as a result of two hurricanes. And there are other issues I know that we want to talk about as well, and we'll get to those if there are questions. We're here to talk about just about anything. We know the Senate still tries to grapple with Trump care, and they continue to fall short in their efforts. Most recently, Senator Collins announcing that she will not support their bill, one again that would really devastate individuals with pre-existing conditions, would devastate a state like New York State, where on average we'd see under this bill over $800 million per congressional district lost by 2026, and increases to other parts of the country at the expense of some of the poorest in our nation. It is one of the worst forms of Trump care that we've seen proposed before the Senate, and we hope that it will find the same result as the other bad bills that were presented, that is the circular file, and that at some point Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and here in the House can come together and work together to bolster and strengthen the Affordable Care Act and not destroy it. We're also concerned about the lack of attention the president has given towards these natural disasters, and instead has chosen to tweet about nonsensical things in many respects, belittling the free expression by athletes in this nation because of their concern as to the social injustices they see taking place around them. And to continue to remain silent is something that they cannot simply stand by and allow to happen. They're driven by moral persuasion and talking to their constituency about how they envision what's happening in the United States today. And the president, in kind, responds by degrading them, degrading their parents. We also see this in terms of what the president is not doing to help garner more support here in the House of Representatives for the DREAM Act. We have a motion to discharge on the floor as we speak. Has over 100 Democrats have signed on to it, we suspect, by the middle of this week, or certainly by the end of business this week, that every Democrat will sign on to the DREAM Act. And we're calling upon our Republican colleagues to really focus on this issue as on the merits of the issue itself, on the moral human cry for us to respond to these 800,000 individuals who are American in every way but on paper. So we have a great deal of work ahead of us, and I do want to recognize my colleagues and give them an opportunity to just briefly describe what's happening. And I first will turn out of seniority to Nydia Velázquez, only because she went to Puerto Rico on Friday last week and can give a first-hand account of what's happening there on the ground. I will then turn to my good friend and colleague, Jose Serrano, also born on the island of Puerto Rico. And then we'll hear from my colleague, Yvette Clarke, to give us an update on what she knows is taking place in the Virgin Islands. So, Nydia?
Thank you, Congressman Crowley, for giving us this opportunity to raise an important issue of 3.5 million Americans who live in Puerto Rico, and also our fellow citizens in the Virgin Islands. I went to Puerto Rico on Friday with Governor Andrew Cuomo. It was one of the first commercial planes to land in Puerto Rico with goods and bottled waters and water and power generators and other type of supplies. I went to Puerto Rico on Friday, and the only thing that I can say is it's a different Puerto Rico. I didn't recognize what I saw. Yet we remain in San Juan and Loíza Aldea, we were not able to go to other part of the island. Pure devastation. This is heart-wrenching. People are suffering. Friday, 100% of the population didn't have electricity, didn't have any power. Hospitals in the island with no power. 90% of the people in Puerto Rico without water. We have seen the videos. We see people going into areas to get water from streams that might be contaminated. There are hundreds of animals laying on the roads dead. There are 14 Superfund sites in Puerto Rico. There is ash from coal that contaminated the soil and the water. We heard this morning the governor of Puerto Rico pleading with the Trump administration, asking for the resources that the people of Puerto Rico need. My concern is based on the behavior of our commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, and the tweets that he put out, that he doesn't grasp the severity of the crisis in Puerto Rico. This is catastrophic. It was a Category 4. It basically devastated the entire island. My message to the president is we need not 100,000 people from the armed services. We need top-notch expert. We need a general to be able to provide and to put together a comprehensive relief emergency response to Puerto Rico. And we need for the government, the federal government, and the U.S. Congress to treat Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands fairly when it comes to disaster relief resources. To the president again, if you don't take this crisis seriously, this is going to be your Katrina. The people of Puerto Rico deserve better from our government. It is our moral responsibility. We have lost 200,000 Puerto Ricans in our wars, fighting for the freedoms that we enjoy today. It is the responsibility of the federal government to show up. We need the presence of the federal government in full force in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Joe?
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Nydia. Nydia gave you the need that exists now, and that's what I wanted to happen, that she would give you that picture so I can give you next week and the week after. Friday night, I call Rodney Frittenhauser, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and he was very kind in telling me, as I asked, that my request that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico be treated equally in any next funding package that comes through. Those of you who know me for many years know that one of my mantras is, the United States and the territories, the United States and the territories. Well, this is a time to really show that. You can't look at this funding and say whatever is left over may go to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. No. It has to be equal to Texas, to Florida, to Louisiana, to Georgia, to Puerto Rico, to the Virgin Islands. But Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are facing a unique situation. I don't know how many of you know this. In fact, I was reminded of this yesterday, that Puerto Rico has a temperate temperature. It doesn't get as hot as it gets in Washington in in August, or in New York in August and July. It doesn't get that hot. But it did break records this week. Just 2 days ago, it went to 96 degrees. 96 degrees with standing water is mosquito time. That creates a danger to the community like we haven't seen before, and there has to be a response to that. Then the good news for me is that Saturday night, what Chairman Fieldhauser had told me via phone, he put out in a statement. And that statement for all of you is available from his office, in which he says the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico will be treated equally. This morning, Speaker Ryan, in a conversation with me, said that some people had asked him about treatment, and he said the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico will be treated equally. I harp on that because that is so important and such a departure from the past, that we can do it this way, and it's the right way to do it. So now it's incumbent on us to stay on top of the leadership to make sure that a certain segment of the other party doesn't break this promise that the Speaker and the Chairman of Appropriations have put out. I believe they're sincere. I believe they understand the severity of the case, and I understand that we have to stay on top to make it happen. And we thank you for the coverage that you've been giving this story. It's the first time that a lot of Americans, unfortunately, have found out where two of our territories are. It took a tragedy for it to happen, but it has happened, and so we can go forward from here. Which then reminds me of one last thing. When we rebuild, it is our suggestion that it's not just rebuilding for the sake of putting up something where something existed before. It's rebuilding a Puerto Rico and a Virgin Islands that is stronger than it was before, so it can take this, because regardless of what they may tell you, at the White House, there is something going on with climate, and this is just the beginning. It's going to continue to go on, and we have to make sure that all people living under the American flag are protected equally. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Congresswoman Velasquez and Congressman Serrano for their ongoing commitment and focus on what is a humanitarian crisis. I'm here on behalf of Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, who is currently in the U.S. Virgin Islands, to just share with you some things that she wanted Washington to know. On September 19th, Hurricane Maria made landfall in the U.S. Virgin Islands as a Category 5. With peak winds above 130 miles per hour, it devastated St. Croix, taking out all of its electricity, its hospitals, and its infrastructure. The base of relief efforts for St. John and St. Thomas was St. Croix. Less than 2 weeks after the Category 5 Hurricane Irma spared that very same island. Nearly a week later, power outages continue to be widespread across all 3 islands of the USVI, and the lone hospital on St. Thomas is destroyed. The infrastructure, Hurricanes Irma and Maria destroyed crucial health facilities, ports, government buildings, all across all 3 main islands. I think it's important for us to recognize that these territories are tri-island states, and they need an overwhelming response to what is already a humanitarian crisis. When there's no food, there's no water, there's no access to medical facilities or medical personnel, medications, it's a humanitarian crisis. And so I stand with my colleagues to say it is critical, not tomorrow, not next week, that we mobilize all of the resource at our disposal to get into that Caribbean region now before many lives are lost. I recognize and recall with horror what happened with Hurricane Katrina. This is Katrina times 6. And we have got to really make sure that the U.S. government uses everything at its disposal to move into that region and to begin deploying life-saving measures at this time. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, once again. Certainly, I'll be here for any questions anyone may have with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands, but I stand shoulder to shoulder. These are territories that are of U.S. citizens, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, alongside Puerto Rico, will be making sure that members of the Democratic Conference are speaking loudly to make sure that the attention is turned to these territories and the relief that they require at this point is deployed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. As you can hear by my colleagues and their testimony here this morning, the level of devastation is unprecedented. And I think that's what we need to drive home to the American people, that they may not be seeing enough because, quite frankly, everything is out of power. The ability for the media to even get into the inner parts of the islands of Puerto Rico and even the Virgin Islands is very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to do so. Nydia herself had mentioned earlier in the conference, in the caucus, that when she visited the island, that she was not able to go into the inner portions of the island, but also she was concerned of being in the way of relief efforts as well, and we applaud that aspect, that selfless act as well. But we need the American people to understand that we're talking about fellow Americans. If this happened in Florida or in Texas or in Louisiana or in New York or any other part of the country, the response would be met head on and full on, and we need to see that same response now. This is not a time to cast aspersions or blame. We were not ready for this event, but at the same time, we have the ability to respond. We know we do. We've seen our military intercede elsewhere around the world. We know, if we put our minds to it, there are hospitals that have been destroyed. There are not enough doctors on these islands. We need mass units set up. We need operations that need to take place. We need medical attention that is urgent to be attended to as well. Life and death. This is a matter of life and death. And that's what the American people need to understand. That's what our president needs to understand as well. With that, we'll take questions.
So are you contending that at least so far there's been a double standard in terms of the allocation of resources or attention given to the islands?
Well, I don't want to, again, say at this point, cast aspersions. I think history will determine whether there was a double standard or not. I would prefer that at this point in time we stay focused on getting the relief to the people. That is paramount. That is what's important right now. I note that I was told that a medical ship was in Norfolk, Virginia yesterday and has not moved towards this region. We would hope that at the very least that ship would make its way down to the islands. But we're looking for even more robust response. That's just one example, and maybe just an example of what we're not seeing take place. We need, as Nydia and Congressman Serrano had said, we need an organized effort. We need a general to be put in place. We know that Secretary Kelly knows these islands like no one else. He understands the structure of them. I think he knows how to get equipment into them. And maybe it's fortunate he's there as the Chief of Staff to the White House. But we need to see that overwhelming response. Unfortunately, what we've seen from the White House over the weekend has been a diversion, a distraction to really nonsensical issues. And when we should be focusing the nation's attention on the human catastrophe and the needs of the people of the Virgin Islands and of Puerto Rico. People's lives are at stake.
So you all mentioned, well, you and Congressman Velasquez mentioned general. With Katrina, Bush administration appointed General Honoree to oversee that effort. That's what you're looking for.
Correct.
Absolutely.
We need, as I mentioned before, a monumental response. There are areas in Puerto Rico that have not been able to be reached. So we don't know the level of more death. I heard this morning that it has risen from 10 to 16. And so we are dealing with an island that was suffering from a recession, a bankruptcy, a Medicaid cliff. Basically, the healthcare system in Puerto Rico collapsed before this hurricane hit Puerto Rico. So we have to understand the needs and the gravity of this situation. And unless we have someone that could coordinate the relief effort and then the rebuilding of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, we're going to be here discussing this issue. And I hope that it's not about criticizing the administration. My fear is that no one in the administration has really understand the gravity of the situation in Puerto Rico. This is evolving, and some people are saying it's already a humanitarian crisis.
It is an unprecedented storm and an unprecedented level of destruction on the islands, and it needs to be met with an unprecedented response. And so far, what we have been able to perceive, it has been anemic in terms of that response. There's time to turn this around. We're calling upon the president in a bipartisan way to respond to the human need and suffering that's taking place on the islands.
One of the things that when you talk to the energy department or other people, they talk about the logistical challenges. You can't just drive trucks down there like you could in Florida. I mean, can you talk about that just in terms of the actual infrastructure that's there even to help rescuers get there?
Well, the power grid, the electric infrastructure basically has been destroyed. We need manpower, even for the distribution of gasoline, because all these gas stations were destroyed. And so there are lines of hundreds of people everywhere in Puerto Rico trying to get gasoline or trying to get diesel. This is why we need a big presence from the military with every equipment and every tool to help us restore the power grid.
And
we don't talk. We haven't mentioned Vieques and Culebra, the two other islands. It is amazing to see the kind of emails and telephone calls, sporadics, because if I try to communicate back with them, I can't. So this is in Vieques, the generator that is keeping the only hospital open is about to collapse, and they're having trouble with it.
I have another question.
with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands, what we're saying is we need a military response. These are islands. And so the Navy needs to move in, National Guard, all those who have vessels that can move generators into the region, bring in water, bring in food. Right now, people are starving and people are dehydrated. This is a tropical region, so that means the heat is on them. And so what we're talking about is not an evolving humanitarian crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis in process. We're asking that our military, our National Guard move into this region. They can get there fairly quickly off of Florida, and it needs to happen today. We can't wait for the weekend. People are losing their lives. There are children. There are elderly. There are those who are disabled. There are those who need medications. There's no refrigeration there. So if your medication needs to be refrigerated, you're out of luck. Dialysis, there is a whole lot that our military needs to bring in through its capabilities to help sustain life at this stage.
Including
You
Navy.
said that this is Katrina times 6.
There are 6 islands.
Okay,
So that means that each island has been decimated. As Nydia has said, Puerto Rico, and I said this earlier, it's 3 islands. People speak of Puerto Rico and they speak of the main island, but there are 2 other islands. Likewise, with the Virgin Islands, you have St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, all separate islands, all inhabited islands.
Can I just say, we know how to do this. We're the United States of America.
Right.
We have the greatest military the world has ever seen. We know how to invade other nations. We know how to bring that equipment in. We have paratroopers. We have sailors. We have Marines. We have men and women who would want to help their fellow countrymen in a time of need. It's time for the president to invoke that and to bring that type of response. Yes, sir.
A group of Democrats under the leadership of Congresswoman Velázquez asked yesterday for a waiver in the
Jones Act.
Yes, and
the spokesperson of the Homeland Security said last night to AP that it is not needed.
well,
Also, I would like to comment regarding the tweet of President Trump last night alluding to the conflict of Puerto Rico.
I feel offended and insulted to see a type of tweet from the president blaming the people of Puerto Rico for a natural disaster and then the public debt. We are better than that, and I expect more from our president. Right now, this is a matter of death, life and death issues. Just yesterday, I got a call from one of my constituents crying, telling me that his niece was scheduled to have a surgery to replace a valve, and without it, that she could die. These are the stories that the people in Puerto Rico are facing. I don't have time to pay attention to nonsensical tweets. If the president doesn't grasp the severity of this situation, this is going to be his legacy. It's going to be Puerto Rico, Virgin Island, and all these islands' legacy in terms of a humanitarian crisis for the world to see. This is the most powerful country in the world, and this is how we treat our citizens. Shame on us.
If I could just add to that, I think it's comical coming from this president, questioning the fact that a natural disaster hit Puerto Rico and they're suffering because of their issues of debt. Here's a president who has used bankruptcy throughout his entire career. If that was the summoning of a natural disaster, Manhattan wouldn't exist today. Queens County, my home borough, where he was from, wouldn't exist today if this is Mother Nature calling. It's absolutely ridiculous that when people are suffering and dying on the islands of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, to again talk about something that is irrelevant at this point. The level of response needed for the bankruptcy is dwarfed by the level of response needed now by this hurricane. Puerto Rico alone, we believe, will need anywhere between $85 billion and $100 billion in infusion. Part of that will come from the private sector in terms of insurance, but it will not be enough. Again, it's just one of those distractions that the president's throwing out there, like kneeling at a football game. It is just utterly ridiculous. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to ask about the FAA privatization bill last night that Democrats voted against that also included portions for hurricane relief. I saw the statements from leadership yesterday, but why did Democrats vote against, the provisions that dealt with flood insurance, and what would you like to see moving forward to working with, the Republican leadership on a plan to overhaul the flood?
We hope that the Republicans will now take this bill, go through regular order, and infuse in that bill and that language that we believe is acceptable to the Democratic caucus in a bipartisan way. And that's what will happen now. They tried to ram it through last night, a very political bill, a Christmas tree for the Republican Party. It does not adequately address in any way, shape, or form the needs of Puerto Rico right now. Where was EITC for Puerto Rico and for the Virgin Islands in that bill? It didn't exist. Even the tax provisions were woefully lacking. So we need to have a real comprehensive bill for the floor, and we need to pass the FAA bill. We recognize that. And it won't happen because of Democrats, quite frankly. They're in charge. They'll bring the bill back again this week. We're confident that it will pass, but it will have Democrat, priorities included in that bill. Yeah, Mike.
Last question.
In terms of, you mentioned the cost of recovery in Puerto Rico over the longer term, and there was mention of some conversations with Paul Ryan. What's your understanding about the timeline for congressional action in terms of a relief package, and are there any estimates about?
Well, we think there are two things going on here. One is a relief package that we can. I think Congressman Serrano made reference to his conversations with Rodney Friedlinghausen, as well as Nita Lowey and Kate Granger and others, in terms of the response in a bipartisan way. They have been assured that the islands will be treated and the territories will be treated like states in that response. That's in early October and then beyond as well. What we're talking about, though, is an immediate response, an unprecedented emergent response by the president. These islands have been hit with the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Their agriculture has been decimated. Their small businesses have been decimated. Their hotels, their hospitals, their schools, their ability to deliver water, the electricity grid is down. Water to deliver fuel from the pumps does not exist. The country has been blown back to the mid 1800s, and it needs an immediate response by the president, by our military to get in there. So there are a couple of angles we're working here. We do recognize what Congress's role is as well, and that is when there is an appropriations bill that is a robust one for the recovery of Puerto Rico and the islands, as well as the damage done to Texas and Florida and other parts of our country due to the natural disasters and hurricanes as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you.